Strange but true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. This next account is really more of a series of events experienced by a group of family and friends in the Australian bush. Before we share that story, though, we here at SBT would like to pass along our best to the people impacted by the bushfires in New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland over the past several months. We add our thanks to the many who've already said thank you to the first responders helping save lives, both human and animal, in Australia, and hope that things can get back to as close to normal as it can get real soon. If you would like to help those affected by the Australian bushfires, we put a few links in the description below. Our story today is not related to the current bushfire situation in any way, and the events took place about 25 years ago. When I was a kid, my family, aunties, uncles, and various cousins would go camping every summer holiday together. However, this annual event was going to be our last group camping expedition together ever again. It was sad, but we were all looking forward to it. It was the mid-90s, incredibly hot, and Sydney was in the grip of a drought. Ivan Milat, the infamous backpacker serial killer, had just been caught, and bodies were turning up in the national park not far from where I lived. 7 in total were found, but it was rumored to be a lot more. In any case, we were camping by a gushing riverside far from there, in a place called Wallandilly River Station in Mittagong, about an hour and a half south of Sydney, and an hour from the famed Wombeyan Caves. One twisting road in, one twisting road out. We had been coming here for several years, and we had the best spot picked out. It was secluded, lots of shade, right next to the river, but, it was close to the exit. From memory, there were about 3 or 4 families on this trip. My family included my parents and us 5 kids, my cousin's family of 5, and their friend's young family of 5, including twins. I'm not 100% sure if my other cousin's family was there, but it's really not that important. The point is, there were a lot of us, around 20 young kids and adults. So to give you an idea of the layout, our campsite is tucked into a dead-end triangular corner. Looking at the dead-end point, there are trees in front of which we erected our food tent. In front of this was the fire pit, and to our left was the raging river, with all the tents lined up parallel and facing it. And then to our right, we parked our cars in a line in front of a hill that went up to the winding road above, which had brought us in here. So we were essentially surrounded on 3 sides, and the nearest people to us were several hundred meters away down the river. And I remember that this particular year, the wildlife were out in force, more than I could ever remember. There were the usual kangaroos, but this time we spotted water rats, wombats, lots of lizards, and even a red-bellied black snake, very poisonous, spotted really close to our tents. So apart from that, the first day was relatively uneventful. We set up our tents, splashed around in the water a little bit, just kind of settled in. Now, little did we know that first night, things were going to get interesting. My cousins recounted the story at breakfast the next morning, and they said that after we all sat around the campfire that night, we went off to our tents one by one to get some sleep. And the campsite quieted down, and they saw and heard someone around their tent playing with their windows. They had them all tied up, but someone was walking around their tent and letting them all down. They said that they thought I was playing a trick on them, trying to scare them, and they called out to me to stop creeping about and go back to my tent. But I was asleep in my tent further down the line. In fact, everyone in our large group was already asleep, or at least in their own tents by this time. My cousins were creeped out, but they just shrugged it off and thought I was lying and was still trying to creep them out. And I tried to tell them it wasn't me, but whatever. All right, so the next night, we're all around the campfire again, and we're talking, roasting marshmallows over the fire, when us kids decided to go hang out in one of our cars behind the tent while the adults hung around the fire pit. Now, we're all in our young to mid-teens, and And for some reason, we started talking about all this existential stuff, the meaning of life, looking up at the stars through the windows. And suddenly we realized it was really quiet. We thought, did the adults go to bed and just leave us here in the car to hang out? It seemed unlikely, but that's what we figured. But then something strange was happening. The fire pit, which from the vantage point of the car was just out of sight behind a tent, but whose glow would light up the food tent, kept simmering down to nothing. Then suddenly it would flare up again, really bright, lighting up the food tent like a spotlight was on it. And then it would die down to nothing again. It did this several times, and we talked about it, debated what it could be causing it, if maybe one of the adults was just stoking the fire or tossing something on it, because it seemed like the fire had completely died out, then suddenly just flared up out of nothing in these really big flames. So by this time of the night, we had kind of been, trying to scare each other, spooking ourselves with scary stories, and we were already freaked out. So we nominated my brother, who he wasn't the oldest, but he was the oldest in the car at the time, and we told him to go check it out and see what was causing the fire to flare up and extinguish it and just, let it die out. So we took a deep breath, and he went. As soon as he was out of the car, we locked all the doors, and we'd planned our escape should something come after us. And we all watched my brother intently as he walked slowly past the last tent that was obscuring the fire, and he just stood there, looking at the fire. And suddenly the fire flares up again, and he turned and quickly ran back to the car, and he frantically tried to open the door, but we forgot we had locked it. As we unlock it, he jumps in, he's all freaked out, and of course we were panicked, and we asked him what had happened. What did he see? And he said that when he first saw the fire, it was just low flames, just kind of simmering embers, and then it flared up. And what he saw was a big yellow ball hovering over the fire pit, not attached to it, not part of any flames. But as he described it, it was a separate entity, a glowing ball of light just hovering over it, which again lit up everything around us. So naturally, he freaked and ran back to the car. Although now it's getting a little late, we're supposed to be in bed. We're all too scared to get out of the car to go back to our tents. So we waited until the fire seemed to stop behaving erratically, and we all got back out of the car and went to our tents together, trying to avoid looking at the campfire. We woke up the next morning. We told our parents what we had seen or what my brother had seen, and they just laughed and said it was our imaginations. The next day passed uneventfully. We drove up to the Wombian Caves for the day, which is why we probably didn't experience anything abnormal through the daylight hours, but that night was another story. We were all exhausted from the day of trekking through caves, and when we came back, we had our dinner around the campfire, and a lot of people went on to bed. But me, my two brothers, and my dad stayed up a little longer, listening to my eldest brother play guitar. At some point, my dad decided to go for a walk by the riverside, wandering off into the darkness to our right from the tents. 10 or so minutes later, we hear some splashing by the water to our left, which makes us jump a little bit, but we just assumed maybe it was the kangaroos who go down there in the middle of the night for a drink and just waiting for us to go to bed so that they can raid our food scraps. But just as I was looking towards where the water was splashing, trying to catch a glimpse of a kangaroo, I could see someone walk down from the tents in jeans and a white t-shirt. But it looked white all over, like a spotlight was partially on it. I assumed it was my dad going to see what the commotion was in the water, but just as I thought that, my dad appeared next to me from my right. He never once walked to my left where I saw this man and heard the noise. I waited to see if it was one of the adults from the tent, maybe going to the bathroom or something, but no one ever returned. My dad went down to investigate when I told him what I had seen, and he said he didn't see anyone down there. But again, I told him I clearly saw someone in white, blue jeans, spotlighted, walking down from our tents to the riverside, and and that person never came back. The next day, we all decided to cross the river and climb a big hill opposite our campsite. It looked big enough for the challenge that we were looking for, but not so big that it was impossible. But it was rugged bush trekking, no pathways or signs to direct us. So we all embarked, and over time, our group staggered apart. At some parts, it got a little treacherous, and we had to find ways to get around some big rocks, or there were sudden drops in the dense bush, but we all found a way through eventually and wound up a little further down the river than where we started. Once most of us had arrived back at the campsite, we realized that our parents had not arrived. My father had only recently been diagnosed with diabetes, so we thought maybe something had happened, and an hour or so passed and still nothing. Some of the adults went back up to find them, and they did. And when they finally arrived back to camp safe and sound, several hours later, my parents told this story. My mother said that she had started to fall back from the group because my dad was struggling a little. They had lost sight of the rest of us, but they kept on going. And at some point, they had reached a place where they physically couldn't go any further. They didn't know where to go. On one side, there was a sheer drop. On the other side, there were some big boulders, and they didn't know what to do. They looked ahead to see if they could spot any of us to get an idea of where they should go, and they couldn't see anybody. However, they did see a man who stood out to them just up ahead. He was dressed in all white. He was way off ahead, but he waved to my parents as if to say, "Come this way." So they backtracked a little and maneuvered themselves to get closer to his position, and they lost sight of him again in the process. But when they stopped next, realized it was impossible to get to where the man was, there just wasn't any physical way to get there, they saw him again, a little further away, waving at them to come to where he was now, and so they changed their direction a little, found a way down to where he was, but they lost sight of him again. Eventually, after many hours and rest stops for my dad, they managed to somehow find a way safely down the mountain and back to our campsite. They wanted to thank the man in white for leading them back to safety, back to where their campsite was. But they never came across that man again. They never saw him after that second time. And yet, he had somehow directed them back to safety. By the time they reached the campsite, my dad's sugar levels were quite low, and he needed sugar quickly. Had he been up there longer, it could have been disastrous and a whole different story. I think that was the last night, and we all packed up the next morning and we went home. But the supernatural events didn't end just there. A week or so later, we heard from our cousin's friends and family who had joined us on the trip. And they had gotten home, and they were all exhausted. They put their twin girls to bed, and the wife went to bed too. But the dad stayed up to play on his computer a little bit. He explained he was in the living room of his house, and from his seat, he could look down the hallway to all the bedrooms where the kids and his wife were sleeping. It's late at this time, after midnight, he recalled, and he heard a child crying. He let it go for a moment, thinking that one of his kids having a bad dream. It'll pass, I'll go back to sleep. But the crying got louder. He looked down the hall and he saw a child standing at the end of the hallway, crying and looking at him. Well, he just assumed it's one of his. He got up to put him back to bed. But when he looked up, the child had vanished and the crying immediately stopped. He looked into his kids' room and all the kids were sound asleep. They were all in their beds, not a single one crying, and obviously there was no indication that any of them had just been out of bed. Now that's a creepy enough ending to the story, but I want to add one more thing. I mentioned Ivan Milat, the backpacker serial killer, at the beginning of the story. Well, it turns out he used to frequent the area that we were camping, and in fact owned a property somewhere nearby. And it's maintained even today, some 25 years later, that there's still more victims and more bodies yet to be discovered, perhaps even in the very bushland where we were camping. Was the man in white one of his victims? Well, we don't know, but we are very thankful for whoever that was that helped our parents navigate back down and safely into our camp. This has been another strange but true story sent to us by a subscriber in Australia. So tell us your thoughts on this story in the comments below. And if you have a strange story that you'd like to send to us, you can send it in an email to strangebutTrueStories2@gmail.com. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we are now on Patreon if you would like to support us in a little different way. There's a link below. Special thanks to these people who signed on to support us. So thank you to Mel and Julie, St. Ricky, Michael E., KJ, Stevie B. Thank you for the kind comments. Albert, Stuart, Grant, Sarah, Leslie, and the answer to your question is no, at least not yet, and Bonnie. And thanks to all for watching this video. I'm Steve White. Until next time.